Today on episode 260 of the Tabletop SportCast, I'm counting down the moments that redefined my tabletop journey. Welcome back to the Tabletop SportCast, where we talk about tabletop sports games through interviews, game reviews, project discussions, because the best sports moments aren't just told, they're played. I'm your host, James Cast, and this is episode 260. We are going to count down 10 moments that redefined my tabletop journey. This was going to be a little bit more of a personal episode, and the main topic is going to be more of a chronological countdown rather than a top 10 list. But we are going to cover those 10 moments that really helped redefine how I went about enjoying this great hobby that we all share. I'm not going to be just talking about favorite games, favorite projects, or even my biggest accomplishments, right? But these are going to be actually the things that as I kind of look back at my journey, it really did have a major impact on how I enjoy this hobby. But before we get to that, we're going to be taking a trip around the table and talk a little bit about the latest issue of Sports Sim magazine. We're going to get to that in just a minute. Reviewing last week's episode 259, it was the summer show. Talked all about what I am hoping to accomplish over these next few months as we kind of move into Q3, but really it's the summer season. And I've been in a big baseball kick ever since April rolled around. I've also started getting the itch for football. And I think as things are kind of switching over, that's what's starting to hit my table more often. And right now it's a pretty good mix between baseball and football. And we covered a lot of this in last week's episode and talked a little bit about what my plan is for these next few months. All right, but before we get into today's main topic, let's just take a trip around the table. Right, issue number 23 of Sports Sim magazine is another packed issue, well over 100 pages. And I'm going to talk about 5 things that really stood out to me in this issue. It's a quarterly publication, so every time it comes out, I'm just catching up on some of the key events, catching up on some of the latest game releases, and like most issues, this one is jam-packed full of all of those types of things. So we're going to get right into it and start talking about these 5 things that I'm really hoping you'll take away from the issue. First and foremost, we've got, once again, ST has gone with a community question, like how do you feel about stat keeping? It's a great discussion starter, right? Because every tabletop sport gamer has a relationship with stats. Some need like every number. Some need only enough to help tell that story, and some are just moving away from the heavy stat tracking altogether for various reasons. But it's a great overview. It gets a lot of feedback from different people in the community, and I think it's always a nice addition to the episode. I keep saying episodes, but to each issue that ST is reaching out and soliciting that feedback from his community members. And I really think that this is one of those topics that's really interesting to get people's take on, because I think we're all in different places when it comes to stat keeping. So definitely check that one out. And then I've got to, go with a personal note here too, and say that my article for this issue was all about my latest Face to the Mat Wrestling Federation project. It's entitled From Origins to Apex. I really, wanted to make sure that I kind of captured what it was like putting together this kind of origin story for the, XSE Federation. And the article is less of just a complete playback of how the project went and more about how I went about building the project, including incorporating ChatGPT as like my booking agent. So if you're interested in that take, I tried to put a little spin on it and almost like did it as like an interview of myself, right? So I hope you'll enjoy that article. Another feature that has become a regular staple in each issue has been free stuff, free games or free, additions to different games. And this issue is another example of that. we've got the 2022 season for off the board horse racing. This is Eric Simon's horse racing game, and he has been offering it for free at different times throughout like the Sports Sim magazine history. So 2022 season, really cool. And I love when there's free games. There's also there's some other free materials in here too. There might even be another free game. This gives breeders something that they can play, right? I think last issue we had actually a game from ST. This one we get Eric Simon's contributions. So if you're really curious about horse racing games and seeing what it looks like, one of the things that's great about Eric's game is he rates all the horses for that season. So you've got an entire listing of horses that are available. So check that out as one of the free offerings in issue 23 of Sports Sim magazine. Of course, you got to mention the cover story. This has 4 Score Baseball as the cover story. This is the latest offering from Powder Blue Sports, John Turnbull's contribution to the ever-growing world of baseball games. It's a pretty much like an instant result game, helps you generate baseball scores, give you a little bit of stats behind those. And, John wrote the article, so he gives you kind of a behind the scenes look at what this new quick play baseball game is all about. And talking through some of the design concepts as well. And then the final one that I'm going to mention is this article, Heroes May Not Always Wear Capes. To me, it really captures the spirit of the issue, right? This is all about like the work behind the work, right? The people who are trying to preserve sports history, the people who go through and do all the research that really does help make the tabletop projects that we're doing possible. And that can take on many different aspects. But I do think that there is a lot of research that goes in there. Sometimes it's, access to statistical databases. And so much of the game design that is taking place right now is the result of there being just easily readable, easily digestible statistics for people to just take in and calculate everything, right? There's not a lot of effort that has to go in there. But then you've also got people who are doing research to really help us tell those stories. Maybe it's through books, maybe it's through magazine articles. But those are the things that help kind of generate and spark interest for us in terms of like how we're going to go about playing our projects. And then, every now and again, you're also going to get people who do a good job of blending the two, right? Not only providing you the statistics, but also providing you the story behind the statistics. And I think without those kind of sports reporters, it would be really hard for us to be able to generate the interest that we have for this hobby because there really wouldn't be anything behind these games that we're playing. But I think for most of us, the theater of the mind that we get to take part in as we play these tabletop games is thanks in large part to the research that folks are doing and the stories that they tell that remind us that there is a lot that goes into the history of sports, and that's usually what we're trying to kind of replay on our tabletops. So overall, I'd give issue number 23 a really strong recommendation. It doesn't matter if you're a replay gamer or if you're into doing fictional leagues, if you're interested in game design, or if you're just looking for ideas for your next project, right? There's something here that is likely to spark those ideas. For me, the biggest takeaway wasn't just like one article. It never is. It was the reminder that this hobby is built on creativity, on curiosity, and that we have a community that is constantly finding new ways to keep that sports history alive. I think it's a tribute to what Sports Sim magazine does. I think it's a lot of what I try to do with my podcast and what some other podcasters are trying to do. And it's why so much of it takes on that kind of positive spin, right? We're really not trying to bring out the negative side. We're not, when I talk about doing game reviews, for instance, I'm not looking to, give them ratings. I'm trying to promote the hobby. I think ST does a lot of that also with the magazine. So it might sound like it's a little bit of cheerleaderness and a little bit of the rah-rah, but honestly, it's a hobby we enjoy. And I think this magazine just enhances my enjoyment of the hobby by highlighting all the great things that people are doing out there. So take a look at it. There's a lot more in there besides the things that I covered, but I wanted to at least cover at a high level some of the really great additions that were part of issue number 23. And hopefully you'll get a chance to check that out. And I'll probably put a link to that in the show notes in case you haven't been able to get to it. You can get the ebook version, or you can actually get a print version of it. And I think either one is a great way to help continue to support Sports Sim Magazine and just enhance your enjoyment of the hobby. All right. We're going to come back and we will talk a little bit about these 10 moments that really defined my tabletop journey. So just a reminder from the beginning of the episode, right? What we're going to count down here is it's not a ranked list. This is going to be a chronological list. I'm really going to take you kind of through my journey that has stood the test of time, right? We're talking over 40 years of being part of this gaming community in one way, shape, or form. And what I'm really trying to do with capturing these moments is trace how this hobby has evolved for me over time. And you're going to hear about a lot of different moments that really help define where I am today in this hobby. Right. So these were moments that, again, not my favorite moments, not always, the ones that I would look back and say are the fondest memories, but some of them are. But I would definitely say that each of these moments changed the hobby for me in some way, shape, or form. Right. Sometimes it was changing what I was playing. Sometimes it changed how I played it. Sometimes it changed who I played with. But all of these had really became almost like turning points, right? And when I talk about redefining my tabletop journey, that's really what it was. Is like it was almost like path in a moment in the path, a fork in the road, whatever you want to call it. These were places where things really took a significant change for me. So let's kind of count down through this list. And as we do, I'm going to kind of give you some information that I think will kind of help define it a little bit better too, right? As I go through each of the items on this list, we're going to talk about like what was the hobby like before this? What was that moment like? I'm going to kind of walk you through it. What was the thing that it changed about what I was doing? And then I want you to kind of think about like, one, did you experience similar moments? And two, like what would be like your kind of takeaway from it, And hopefully as I'm going through my list, you are all kind of reflecting on your own moments that really help define like where you were in your journey, regardless of how long that journey has been and how long you've been on it. Right. So we'll start at the top. And my first big moment that I would have to define this with is obviously going to be getting my first tabletop game. Because of my age, a tabletop games preceded a lot of the computer games. I at the time that I got my first game, which was Statis-Pro baseball, I was doing just a little bit with sports. I mean, I was definitely becoming a huge fan. I got this first game came to me as a Christmas gift from my uncle and happened at a time where I was probably about 12. I think I was 12 at the time, maybe 13, but I think it was 12. I don't remember the exact year that it was. And when I got Statis-Pro baseball for the first time, it really just like opened a door. Because for me, before this, it was doing things like, baseball cards were a big part of it. It was, playing some sports in the street, which was great. Watching sports on TV when it was available. But in terms of like games, I didn't really have a whole lot. And I had one baseball game that I played, and I've talked about this before. I don't even know what the name of it was. I picked it up on my first ever trip to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and it was just you rolled 3 6-sided die, and all across this large field where all the numbers spread out. And your job was to kind of like place the ball, and then you had all the fielders and you would move everybody as you kind of went through it. Base runners would move, and you would just see how the play unfolded. So it really made me think a little bit about like the movements of players and everything. But at the same time, it took forever just to play a single at bat, right? It would take minutes to play a single at bat, and to play an entire inning might take me like 30 to 40 minutes just to play like a simple inning. Then comes Statis-Pro baseball. And not only do I have all of these players that were on my baseball cards, right? I have a better sense now of how they were performing through a different distribution of numbers. It really sparked my interest in mathematics. I was starting to keep track of stats. I would do everything by hand, of course, scoring games, learning how to do that. These were all like new activities that I was being introduced to. And here it was, fast action cards, right? Like individual player cards that were replacing my baseball cards, and all this information, all these charts that told me all these different strategic moments that I could take part in, different ratings for how they would bunt, how they would hit and run, right? Their throwing ratings, their fielding ratings, like seeing all the different positions they could play. It opened up this entire world to me. And I started to be able to just sit down and play game after game after game of this great sport. And being a huge baseball fan, and I was a fan of most sports at this point, but I would think because of all the baseball cards and everything, this is the one that it was the gateway moment. It triggered everything for me, and I needed to find out more. And as a result of that game, my uncle introduced me to other games. I got the chance to see like Pay Dirt and Bowl Bound, and started like, trying to find out. And all of a sudden I was looking in stores and trying to see where I could find other games. And I think the only other game I bought for the next few years was Superstar Baseball, which was like the SI baseball version. And that had the Hall of Fame players in it, right? So I got a chance to see both sides of it now. Now I had my current guys in Statis-Pro, and I had like these historical greats through Superstar Baseball. So that was a huge moment for me and really kind of redefined what it looked like for me to sit down and enter this new world of tabletop sports gaming. And that kept me really entertained for a number of years. And then just a few years later, though, we ended up getting like a Commodore 64. That was like our first home personal computer. And it wasn't long after that we got our first computer sim game. There were other sports games I was playing. I can remember the first game we had for our Commodore 64 was actually this like one-on-one basketball game. It was like Larry Bird and Dr. J, right? But the first sim game that I had, and I would end up getting a bunch of different baseball ones, but it was MicroLeague Baseball. And now, not only did I have what I had from my tabletop game, now I could actually see them moving around. I could see the players, and the ball and everything. I got to actually some more imagery coming with, instead of just theater of the mind, I actually had this game playing in front of me. And I had a much better way to keep track of statistics. So I wouldn't say it replaced cards and dice at this point, right? But it definitely gave me another version of like that same dream, right? I was able to manage teams. I was able to make some decisions, and I could see those kind of sports history moments like opening up. And I got different teams as a result of this too, right? It wasn't just the current season. It actually had like a list of like historical teams. And that opened the door to like seeing other games. I remember Tony La Russa Baseball being one of the early ones that I got into. And then eventually, like, because I was like in college and, had less access to bringing tabletop games with me everywhere, I got more and more into the computer sim space. And I would say for the next, 10 to 12 years, I was probably more of a computer sim gamer than I was a tabletop gamer. So this definitely was a significant moment for me. It led me to places like, APA for Windows, right? I was playing baseball for Windows a lot. I was getting into the action PC sports games, mostly football, and really enjoying those. I was also probably at this point really getting into a lot of the other video games too, playing things like Madden and NHL hockey. And, I remember the NCAA college football being one of my favorite ones, wrestling games. Like there was all these different sports games. And anytime I sat down and played video games, I would say 8 out of 10 times, like 80% of the time, maybe even 90% of the time, when I got in front of one of those consoles, it was to play a sports game. It wasn't to play anything else. I wasn't playing shooter games a lot or any of those other things. It was mostly sports games that I was playing. So MicroLeague definitely was a defining moment. It kind of took me a little bit away from the cards and dice version of the hobby, but still kept me really entrenched in the hobby. What replaced it is probably that third moment in this journey, and my kind of analog version of this all of a sudden transformed with the introduction of fantasy football. When I got introduced to fantasy football for the first time, it really opened a new door for me, right? So now I had moved away from the cards and dice games and had moved now towards these computer sim games. And while I was playing a lot of the computer sim games, I still had this draw for like, how do I do this in an analog way? And I think fantasy football did that. I remember picking up a book. It talked all about like how to set up leagues, and I started running leagues. I started, running leagues with family members, with friends, and really got into it. Ended up getting into like, rotisserie baseball leagues and, being part in like auctions and then fantasy football, right? So not only was I now trying to figure out like how to run a league, run a schedule, keep track of the stats, starting to introduce other tools, things like Excel started to become a big part of what I was doing. And I needed to like get more and more focused. And I think not only did fantasy football change my approach to the hobby, right, and introduce me to this kind of like tabletop adjacent experience, but it also changed the way I was watching sports. Because now it wasn't just about my teams. It wasn't just about my New York-based teams. Now I was becoming a fan of the entire league, right? I was watching players from all over. If they were on my team, they became part of, my sports world as well. And yeah, like anybody else, I had people on my fantasy teams that I hated, but they had to be on my team because they were a good player. But, it was always that tough one. It's like, oh, now how do I root for these guys? Like, I need some points from him, but he's also going against my team. And that really changed the hobby for me in a lot of ways, right? And my sports viewing probably more than this hobby, because now it became more about winning the games and winning my games and rooting for players who probably in the past I wouldn't have rooted for. So fantasy football became like that new kind of itch that got scratched. And I really enjoyed taking part in those leagues. They really did change my fandom for the sports. But it gave me this other way to be like, kind of like, commander of my forces in a sense, right? And I think that that's one of the things that has always been a draw for these tabletop sports is this is my league that I'm playing, and I got a chance to kind of run it my way. That led to the next really big revelation, and this was the first time that I can remember. And the fourth item is Stats Inc. And some of you might remember it, but Stats Inc. became this great access point to picking up statistical, information. Before there was the baseball references and the pro football references, getting like all of the stats in one place was hard to do. And Stats Inc. became a great place for me to be able to go and get that information. And I was able to get historical information at times. I was able to start seeing how players acted. And this started to get me like thinking about like how would I design some games? Even though I never really went down that path too far, it did help me as I started to think about, well, maybe I can like make cards for players for these different games. And I started using it for my fantasy football leagues too, right? It became a way that I could get the stats before they started really coming out with a lot of the online services that you could get for your fantasy sports. Those came a couple years later, but I paid a subscription, was able to get Stats Inc., got into it from like Baseball Weekly, the old like magazine. Like these are all things that I was like paying money for now to get information delivered to me about these different sports. Stats now became more than just numbers, all right? They became the language of this hobby for me. And I think that that was a key point in this, is that I needed that information. I needed a way to get it and be able to manipulate it in my way. And Stats Inc. gave me that ability by allowing me to download those stats and, use it to like put things together for everybody. So huge defining moment. And it's probably related, and the one thing I didn't put in here, but my access to Stats Inc. was obviously the internet. And the internet in itself was a transformational idea. And I didn't list it as its like single thing because it opened the door to so many other things that I wanted to make sure I kind of like put it in the background. But Stats Inc. was like really the first thing I really took advantage of the internet with. And it was followed shortly by being introduced to things like these community forums. And that's number 5 on this list. I'm going to list 3 of them: Delphi forums, Yahoo groups, and then Facebook. And I think chronologically in those orders. I think that Delphi forums was like the first thing that I really got hooked into. Yahoo groups really started to expand it as I started to find more specific information about this hobby, and then Facebook. The other thing that started to happen, and it's almost like paradoxical here is that as I started to get introduced to these different internet community groups, I really started to lose my interest in computer sim gaming and got reintroduced to those tabletop games. I started seeing people who were talking about playing these games that I had played way back when. And I also started to find out about these other games that I had kind of watched from afar, but I wasn't really taking part in. And then I got introduced to even different people who were putting out other sports things. And all of a sudden I was like, wow, I could play games besides these basic 4 sports. I started finding people who had information about Statis-Pro basketball, which I had always watched from afar, but never had a chance to play, and decathlon and and then Downey Sports, right? Like all of these things started to become available to me. And the PDFs, which I didn't put on this list either, but PDFs changed this hobby again for me. And they all came as a result of these different forums that I was taking part. And Tom McHugh is a big contributor to like Sports Sim magazine. And we had him on an episode. Like he was one of the people that I met through Yahoo groups, right? Because he was sharing information about this new Centennial version of the game. There were all these other great games that I started taking part in as a result of being part of these community groups and seeing what people were sharing and being introduced to newer games. And so that was a big defining moment for me, because now it wasn't just me anymore. Like all of a sudden I realized that, and probably this happened for so many others too, right? Like I was brought into the community, and it was less about just me and my solo hobby. It was now I got a chance to see all these different things that people were doing with these tabletop games. And it really was almost like turning off a light switch, because when I got introduced to a lot of these groups, I stopped playing a lot of the computer sim games and really got reintroduced to the tabletop games again. And it came at a time when I probably needed, like so many others, to shift away from the computers, because the computers were dominating everything I was doing now, right? And I wanted something that allowed me to get away from the computer a little bit more. So these groups really helped to do that. And they happened in that kind of chronological order. It was Delphi, then it was Yahoo, and then it was Facebook. Somewhere in that journey, I also got introduced to number 6, which was this league that I got a chance to play online. And I was playing in a lot of online leagues, a lot through Action. I remember there was a couple of Action PC football leagues I was in, and I played in a number of leagues with baseball for Windows. But then I found out about some people who actually had a league for a version of Statis-Pro baseball. And so it was a full circle moment here. And they said, hey, is anybody, a big player? And I was like, I got to get back to that game. So I reached out to this guy, and he was running this great American Fantasy League. And I've talked about this before on the podcast as well. But the Gaffle was this league that they were playing with all-time rosters for each of the different franchises. They had owners for each of the different franchises, and they were looking for some new owners. And I didn't get a chance to play with any of the great teams. Like my first team, they were like, the team we have available right now is the Florida Marlins. I was like, that's fine. It's just me playing this game, so I don't care what roster I have. And so my team was the Florida Marlins. And then wasn't long after being part of that, I started, doing what I typically do, finding a way to get more engaged. And I became the guy who collected all of the scores and produced like what we called our daily scoreboard. Because every week we played one game. Everybody played head-to-head over the phone, so it was a really interactive environment that we were playing in. One of the other owners was Paul Salzgeber, and it was a big moment to meet Paul through this. And, I think Paul and I kind of got connected through that, and he helped lead me into some new directions as well, introduced me to other games that were out there. We're going to talk about that in just a bit too. But this league was really fun, and a lot of these guys were in Sabre, so that became a really interesting thing, and to talk to them and to hear about the research that they were doing. And I've said, like, as I listened to like the 1988 Tops podcast, which is another one I would highly recommend and have before, sometimes I hear them talk about like bios that guys from the league actually wrote, and it's always fun when I hear their names being mentioned, because I remember like sitting down and playing games with them head to head. So that league gave me a lot of spark. during the course of playing with that, I got introduced to things like ball stat because I started keeping more stats for the league and everything. And it just became a lot of fun, right? And during that, I got introduced. Paul introduced me at a point when the league was having some trouble and we were seeing it move in different directions. And I was like, it's been fun, but I need to find something different. And it was Paul who was like, hey, I just found this new game. You should check it out. It's called History Maker Baseball. And, that goes without saying that was a defining moment as well. Again, didn't make my list, History Maker Baseball, but it introduced me to Play. And it wasn't long after being introduced to Play, probably within a year or two, that I started hearing about these conventions that they were doing. And I was planning on going to one of their conventions for my 50th birthday, which was going to be in 2020. And then, of course, a pandemic hits. So what does Play do? They hold Plaay-Not-Con, and they held a completely online convention. We got a chance to just spend a weekend playing games, and I had a blast with it. And it was tough. It was tough not being able to physically gather with folks, but I just enjoyed being introduced to the idea of a convention and taking part in playing all these games. And it probably set me on the wrong tone when I attended in person the next year for the first time, because I was coming in with this idea like, yeah, we're just going to sit and play games all weekend. And luckily, I got the other experience of we played some games, but we also had a lot of time to just talk about games, and that became a much more connective moment for me. But 2020, the Plaay-Not-Con while it was a highly isolated year, the virtual convention became a celebration of the community. And the fact that we were able to pull that off, we had chats going, we had online games going, we were connecting at a time where people just weren't able to, connect as much as we wanted to. So Plaay-Not-Con became that moment that really introduced me to this hobby has a lot to offer. So number 7, Plaay-Not-Con 2020 really showed me that, we can be playing on different tables, but we can also still be connected. And it helped me connect with folks in a way much greater than even those different forums online were able to do. And as I came out of Plaay-Not-Con, which was probably like July, August timeframe, I started thinking about all the projects that I was doing and hearing people talk about projects that they were doing. And I decided because it was the pandemic and because I was doing so much gaming, because there wasn't a whole lot else to do at that point, it was number 8 for me is starting my gaming log. I started this in September of 2020, and it has become a way for me to really stay connected and provide me that instant feedback on how am I doing with my gaming hobby. Not really making it a chore necessarily, but this idea of tracking it and being able to see the patterns in how I'm playing, what I'm actually playing, the games that I return to, the projects that I stayed with, and the ability to also complete the projects, right? Because I think as I introduced the gaming log, I went back and started looking at a lot of these files that I was creating in my personal drives and saying, you know what? I've got projects that I started and never finished. I need to bring some of those back, and I need to get them back on the table and find a way to bring them across the finish line. And I started to do that. And that really became a big driver. And it really enabled me to use some of the tools that I was using in my work life in terms of project management and just make it, I started to build some of these project management techniques into how I gamed. Not to make it more of a chore, but to actually get the satisfaction of getting things across the finish line. And it really did add to my enjoyment of this hobby. And that then, when I got into the in-person convention, and as I said, 2021, I get to Denver for the first time. I show up, I have all these games with me. I'm expecting to get introduced to other games. I'm expecting to just spend this entire weekend just wall-to-wall gaming and not even thinking of sleeping, just game the whole time, right? And I was luckily surprised by the fact that there was some gaming, but it was mostly conversations. And I think all those conversations helped me hear the way people were interacting with the hobby. Now at work, I was starting to get introduced to this idea of podcasting and thinking about what are the different ways that I could maybe start a podcast, share information, share some of the knowledge that I had from my work life with others. And I was having a hard time kind of getting started with the idea of a podcast because I didn't really know like what my hook would be. But being at the convention really helped me see that there was a hook. There was something I had to offer. And that led to the first ever episode of the Tabletop SportCast. So I actually started recording just as I got home. I started to put some of the ideas of conversations I was having with people at the convention and like on my flight home and just thinking about it for the week after that, thinking there are some ideas that I have that I think will help people. And so my hook for the Tabletop SportCast initially became, let's teach people how to be better at project management with this hobby. Let's show them those skills that I'm using at work, things like agile and project management, process management, bring all those things to the table and show it in a different way so that they can see how they can take those techniques and use them inside of our. And so the Tabletop SportCast was born, and that was pivotal. That was pivotal moment number 9. It definitely became a turning point for me with this hobby. I was now connecting with people in a different way. And for the first year or so, it was mostly in a quiet way. But it started to allow me to be a larger part of the community. And eventually it led to me being able to get people on and interview people and expand my network within this community. So the Tabletop SportCast, the reason I keep doing it is not as much about like feeling a need to do this. It's because of the connectivity that I get with the greater community. And that probably, as you can see in the later part, has become a big part of the journey for me, has been less about what I do on my tabletop and more about how I engage with this larger and larger community. And it led to things like me writing for Sports Magazine. It led to me being able to create things for Play Games and to do play testing for people like Gary Brown and for, with Al Wilson. I've just really enjoyed all the different opportunities that I've had and to meet all these different game designers and get to know them on a more personal level and be able to, really see how they go about approaching the game design work that they do, which has become probably the thing that I enjoy the most learning about these days, is less about people's projects, although I love hearing about those too, and more about how designers are actually approaching the game design piece and actually getting a look behind the curtain at the kind of work that they're doing. So Tabletop SportCast definitely became a defining moment in my gaming journey. And for our final moment, as we get to number 10, it is probably the next big revolution in terms of technology, and that is going to be ChatGPT. Now, I have a lot of issues with the use of AI. I've shared those in the past. I'm not totally happy with everything that's being produced with AI tools. I think there is a lot of garbage that is being created. But I will also say that it has become a tool that I engage with every single day. And ChatGPT, and I use Gemini at work, and I've used other AI tools, including putting this podcast together. Like the software that I have has a lot of AI tools in it as well. They're just becoming things that I'm getting more and more comfortable with seeing as my kind of digital assistants. And ChatGPT has become a creative partner for me in this hobby. What is it doing more than anything? It's that brainstorming partner that I wish that I had on a more regular basis. And it's the perfect one because it's the one that goes away when I don't want it. I get a chance to just store it away and it's not ever present, right? I still have the advantage of being a solo hobbyist for the majority of my time. But when I need it, I can grab ChatGPT and it can help me with creating schedules or thinking through project structures, bouncing around ideas, helping me think through game designs at times as I try to play around with those ideas. Help me with the creativity side of it, that I love doing things like newsletters and I love doing things like game recaps, but I don't really want to spend the time it takes to do all of that writing and stuff. But I still want sometimes to have those things for myself. ChatGPT has become a great partner for all of that stuff. I've done a lot of different videos on YouTube about using ChatGPT. I'll probably do some more in the future as well because it's a nice, easy thing for me to be able to share. And I think more and more I do like interactivity that I get from ChatGPT. It has become a really good partner. And that was one of the things that I covered in the latest issue of Sports Sim Magazine was how I created my own custom GPT to become like that booking agent and to really help me think through, like, let's think through how we're going to put together a show. I still have creative control. And that's one of the things that I really like about ChatGPT is in the end, I get to be the creative director, but I have another assistant who can help me put together those ideas. And yes, it can do things like come up with logos sometimes, and I will take advantage of that. But I try not to lean too heavily on that for the tool because it is one of the things that I don't think it's very good at. I think that unfortunately, and I even see this with the way it writes sometimes and the way it creates images and the way it, just its overall approach, there's a lot of sameness that it generates. And yeah, it's at the point now where I can go through the internet and I see articles, I see pictures, see videos, and there's a lot of sameness there too, right? And so there are some negatives to it, but I think having the creative director approach where I still get final say on things allows me to say what I think is quality and what isn't. And I think everybody needs to have that lens. And everybody's going to have a different approach. Everybody's going to have a different bar that they set, and that's okay. It's just making sure that this idea that you're keeping that human in the loop. And I think you want to always make sure that final say belongs to you and not this digital assistant. You're not going to delegate that authority to these tools. Instead, you're going to let it do what it needs to do, but then you're going to take the final expression for yourself. But at the same time, ChatGPT is transforming the way that I go through this hobby. It has really assisted me in so many ways over the past couple of years. And I do think it's going to be this next evolution. And more and more, I want to test out the limits of it. I want to see what other things that it can do for me. And I'll continue to kind of probe at that and try to figure out like what are the different things that it can do. That's it. There's my list of 10. It's been an amazing journey, and you can see that sometimes these moments took a long time to develop, but over the last few years, they've started to happen more and more often. And I think a lot of that has to do with the technological advances that we are making, but it also has to do with the fact that I'm just getting more and more engaged into this hobby over the last few years too, as I kind of got reintroduced to it. And the reintroduction, probably goes back now like 20 years or so, right? But those past 20 years have seen some serious evolution as well as I've kind of really changed the way that I game at this point in time. All right, we are going to come back and wrap up today's episode. All right, so as I look back at the moments that didn't just change what I was playing, right? I would say throughout all of those times, and you didn't hear me talk about a lot of different games. Early on, I did, really to cover two significant moments. But I think later on, a lot of the games that I got introduced to is all because of community members, right? It's because of that word of mouth. It's because of being able to see people using YouTube. And again, YouTube didn't even make my list, but those all helped me see. So there's been a lot of game evolution as well as I've gone through these years. So this wasn't just about what I played, right? It was more about how I thought about sports, how I connected with people, what helped me to organize projects differently, and my kind of content creation through the hobby as well, right? That's the moments that really redefined my tabletop journey. I have no idea what my next episode's going to be. So as you go through the list, and you think about this episode, and hopefully it was sparking some memories for you. Hopefully it was also sparking some ideas for you, right? But what I would encourage all of you to do is to think about your own hobby, the journey you've been on, and what were your turning points? Maybe there's some crossover, but maybe you would take a little, and almost definitely you're going to take a little bit of a different spin to yours. And if you've got some great moments, share them with me. I'd love to hear about them. Maybe post them even like as I post the episode on like Facebook. Maybe just post them in the comments, but I would love to hear about some of your personal moments that helped redefine your tabletop journey as well. Now, as always, if you'd like to help support the podcast, you can head on over to patreon.com/Tabletop SportCast, where $1 a month goes a long way to helping to offset costs for the podcast. always looking for new supporters, and really appreciate all of you who have kind of stuck with me through the years and helped to continue to support the show. It's meant a lot, and I really greatly appreciate it. Might see some changes to how I'm doing the Patreon soon. I'm thinking about introducing like a new tier there too, so more to come on that. But I'm looking at some things that I might change a little bit about the podcast over the next couple of months, and if I get the time for it, right? So keep an eye out for that. But if you're really interested in helping to support the podcast, Patreon is a great way to do that. You can also go to my Facebook page, facebook.com/Tabletop SportCast. On my Facebook page, if you get there, land there, and you are not yet following the page, please click that and do that. I'm teetering right about, let's double check the numbers right now, but as of last count, I think I was just under 600 followers, and really want to see us kind of get over the top there and see if we can get above 600. And sure enough, where are we now? 598. So come on, people. Let's get 2 more followers in the next week or so and see if we can push that over the 600 barrier. It's been a little bit of a plateau as we've been trying to get across that 600 mark. But what I do on my Facebook page, not only do I share the episodes, but I try to share a little bit of what I'm playing on my tabletop, just to give you an idea about the different things that I am doing as well. And then, as always, if you'd like to reach out, send me an email, tabletopsportcast@gmail.com. That's all one word for Tabletop Sportcast. Tell me about your projects. Tell me about the games that you're playing. Tell me about your defining moments in your gaming journey, because I'd love to have those and maybe share them in our next episode. Speaking of our next episode, I am going to take a look at my ever-growing library, and we're going to talk about 10 games that I would probably make sure stay in my rotation, or really stay on mine. If I had to get down to just 10 games, what are those 10 games going to be? And I'll tell you, this isn't going to just be my 10 best games. These are going to be the 10 that I would want to make sure, if I had to trim my library down to 10, these are the ones that would make it. Give you a little bit of the reasoning why it's those 10 that make the list. So that'll be next week. But until then, thanks for listening.